I think there are three things that we particularly look for. We look at the team, we look at the technology, and we look at the market opportunity in that very same order, but sometimes in different proportions depending on what it is that they're actually building, right? I mean, taking risk is part of our job, right? Because only then you're a deep tech venture capital fund.
Say I'm a founder and I come to you and I say, hey, Nithish, I can build a rocket engine that will take us to 1% the speed of light. I need $30 million.
If your end goal is to build that whole engine and that's going to cost you $30 million, let's backtrack and see what is the smallest experimental technology that I can build with very little capital that shows that I have the proof to build or I have the ability to build some meaningful hardware. And that is also meaningful enough for somebody else to come in and put capital.
On this show, we've explored many startups shaping the space economy. But behind every piece of technology is the capital that fuels the innovation. So this week, I spoke with a venture capitalist investing in the Indian space economy. Meet Nithish Kumar, an investment analyst at Speciale Invest. Speciale Invest is a deep tech venture capital firm based in Chennai and Bangalore. Speciale has backed over 40 companies across industries like energy, nuclear, robotics, and climate. But today, we deep dive into their space investments. You may even have heard of some of these companies, like Angikul Cosmos, building launch vehicles right in the heart of India. On this episode, we cover the evolution of India's space industry, the Indian government's role in enabling private space startups, and how India is able to build such high-quality hardware at a fraction of the cost. My favorite part of this conversation was actually diving into Speciale's first principles approach to vetting ideas. As an aerospace engineer myself, I found this to be relatable. VCs apply many of the same problem-solving strategies I use when I evaluate new designs at work. It was fascinating to see how first principles thinking and venture capital investing go hand in hand. India's space sector is growing rapidly, so Nithish provides unique insights into how visionary founders are building the next generation of space technology. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this podcast with a friend you know. Now, on to the conversation with Nithish Kumar. Okay, Nithish, welcome to the podcast. Can you please introduce yourself for our audience today?
Thank you, Anurag. Thanks so much for having me. Very quickly, if I have to introduce myself, I work at a fund called Speciale Invest on the investments team. We are a deep science and tech venture capital fund based out of Chennai and Bangalore, to the south of India. And we've been investing in deep tech hardware and software since about 2016-17 for about 8 years now, close to a decade. We've invested in over 40 plus companies across sectors like space, climate, energy, nuclear fusion, semiconductors, robotics, and so on and so forth. We are happy to look at anything that's very audacious that can solve some of the biggest problems in the world, but also deeply rooted in science and engineering from that standpoint. And yeah, that's a quick introduction about me and the fund itself.
Your journey is a really interesting one. You're an aerospace engineer turned VC. What motivated you to be on the other side of the table?
I actually wanted to become a good founder, and somehow in doing so, I ended up in VC. I actually, again, my first exposure towards the whole startup ecosystem and space tech and the glitz and glam of it, and also the excitement around it started off with a company called Team Indus. This was one of the very first companies in India, based in Bangalore, that basically kickstarted the whole Indian startup race. I think that whole experience really put a spark in my head to say, wow, this is really exciting. I mean, I didn't even know that something like this can be built here, a private startup and whatnot. And by then, I had also grown very fond of Shark Tank in the US and all of that, right? So I was really puzzled, or part of me was like, why isn't something like this here in India? Of course, it is there now. So we said, I said, okay, maybe we could, this is an opportunity for us to create something for founders, particularly in the deep tech space, or extremely great engineers, but not necessarily the greatest of business people or the greatest of fundraisers, right? So maybe something like this could be of help. Was a very small thesis, but that we had very uninformed as well. But that was good enough for us. And I went in and registered a company, got together a bunch of friends, worked for a year and a half, got to the platform, got a few investors on board. But fortunately, for a lot of reasons, we couldn't launch. And I said, okay, if I had made a lot of mistakes and I don't know how to build something like this, maybe the quickest way to build it is to actually go work with somebody who's done it before. So I literally just did that, went ahead and found a company which was very accessible to me with experienced founders who built and sold companies to Freshworks and Zoho. As such, so I got to work one on one with people like that, founders like that, for about 2 years. And I decided that this was time now for me to do something else. And in one of maybe one of the WhatsApp groups that I was a part of, I think somebody put a link saying, "Hey, Special Invest is hiring." Coincidentally, and this is also one of those life full circle moments where I had Vishesh, who was the managing partner of the fund, on one of my podcasts back in college, and I managed to get an opportunity to secure an interview, and that's how this whole transition occurred.
Really, that's so impressive to see how forming connections in these industries can really matter. But going back to to something you mentioned about the industry itself, you saw Team Indus, which you mentioned was a very early stage startup, one of India's first startups, true startups that ushered in a new era of space in India. Can you describe from your lens what the evolution of the Indian space industry has looked like?
I think this might have been 2017, 18 ish. And we probably had five space tech companies that people would know. Back then, there was a lot of skepticism, even when Team Indus was trying to build something very meaningful. People just didn't really believe that somebody like a ragtag team could just really build out space tech and then put something in space and in orbit. But while Team Indus kickstarted that innovation aspiration bucket and got things going, I think people caught on to the whole wave of space tech and started building with again small satellites and largely system integration components that would go and build into small satellites. And by no means space tech is very new to India by then. It's just that the startup side was very new, right? But we already had the supply chain ecosystem fairly established, at least for ISRO, right? From there, we've had people working on largely subsystem level components for rockets, satellites. And maybe around 2018, 2019 is when the launch vehicle game started off with Agnikul and probably Skyroot on the side, both trying to build. Extremely great teams coming out and saying something for the first time that I'm going to build something really big. Not just a subsystem level component, but rather a main vehicle itself, right? That was a critical aspect of getting to space. And I think Agnikul just became probably 3 4 months back did their first technology demonstration mission successfully, also marking India's first semi cryo flight, and a few other really cool stuff along. And Skyroot happened to also do a mini sounding rocket kind of a test prior to that as well, also successfully, as is. And I think now that's the next frontier of technology, which is in-orbit infrastructure, deep space, and even re-entry vehicles of sorts. And people are really now starting to envision very very big things, and believe that that can be built out of the country. So I think that's the next big evolution that we're seeing from 2017 to now, and it's all fairly young people trying to do something like this. And I mean, credit to people like Pixel as well along the way, who've shown that young folks can build something, again, something really big and meaningful in the industry. And yeah, I think that's how it's progressed.
It's really a cultural shift that the youth is taking so much into their own hands, and they're building the future that they want to see, and that's amazing to see. But if you were to look at this whole picture and go, there's that one thing that is driving the new focus in the Indian space economy, what would that be?
I think a lot of these, again, having very audacious vision is one part. Having energetic founders trying and build something meaningful is another part. I think for all of the space ecosystem to really click and work, there has to be folks like ISRO and the government to do something very meaningful on the policy and the regulatory side of things to have certain things established, right? And once they do that, it really unlocks the ecosystem, tells them what somebody can and can't do, and also create avenues for them to make their life a whole lot easier in terms of testing, in terms of insurance, in terms of a lot of other things that would really be very hard to figure out otherwise, right? I think that part is really the catalyst behind the scenes, which is the very strong policy level and government level progress that our folks have made, that has really established the baseline for somebody to just jump on top of that and then build whatever they want.
This is like ties in perfectly into my question that I had coming up, which was what is the role of the Indian government besides from a policy standpoint that you just described? And it's a very important one. What is the role of the Indian government, say, from a technology perspective, to support the Indian space economy?
The first thing that comes to my mind is Indian government really takes space tech startups extremely seriously, to the extent that whatever projects these startups are working on, the government sees it as if it's their own project, and they want them to succeed, right? And I can just quote you Agnikul's example. Agnikul got to work very, very closely with ISRO. In fact, ISRO was kind enough to allow them to set up their own launch pad inside Sriharikota, which was again ISRO's launch pad island, the area. And if you look at it, the ISRO's test directors worked with Agnikul. ISRO's chairman was really, again, in touch with what Agnikul was up to, and they really cared as much, right? And within that also comes the expertise and also the experience of those folks, right? It's almost as if they tell you if it'll work or not. And I don't think as a startup it gets any better, or you could get something very better than that, right? It's just that these are people who've spent decades doing this, and they're telling us what to do and what not to do, right? And that's the kind of expertise that you would apply for as a founder. And I think the government is more than willing to just give that give that bit to a lot of the startups in the country. That once they get to a certain point, immediately you get that support.
That's very exciting to hear, especially like um, having a government that is pro space, especially given that a lot of these startups are succeeding on on a very hard problem to begin with. And that brings me to Speciale. Speciale is a deep tech firm that invests in founders building very hard things. What would you say is Speciale's general approach to investing in space?
I think irrespective of whether we invest in space or not, I think there are three things that we particularly look for. Every time we approach a founder, or we get to interact with a founder as such, is we look at the team, we look at the technology, and we look at the market opportunity in that very same order, but sometimes in different proportions depending on what it is that they're actually building, right? Us being where we are and where we come at, which is the pre-seed seed stage, we don't have a lot to work with apart from just the team, right? We don't have a product. Sometimes it's largely an idea on paper, and therefore you don't have any revenue or anything to benchmark the success of what this could become. So therefore, there's an overwhelming emphasis on the ability of the team, their prior experiences, what do they know that somebody else do not, and what's really um, uh, exciting the team from a personal standpoint to be able to go out and build this. We care a lot about some of these things, the motivations of the founders also. And on the technology bit, I think we are not afraid to take risks. We are, in fact, we think, I mean, taking risk is one of our is part of our job, right? Because only then you're a deep tech venture capital fund. So I think across the trend, we're excited about technology. I think that's the lens that we apply first, rather than be worried about it. That if something does not exist, then doesn't mean that it can't materialize further. And then we look at the market, of course, at the trailing end. We would ideally like for it to be extremely big at this point in time. If not, at least we want it to be exploding in terms of the rate at which it grows, which means that we're always investing 5, 10 years ahead with that outlook, right? And that's also why it's enabling us to invest in ideas or look at ideas from a different lens than most other VCs. I think this is how we approach every industry and not just space tech.
The last one you mentioned, the TAM, the total addressable market for space, is always a very interesting one because the output is always 5, 10 years behind. GPS and GNSS is a classic example, right? Like navigation systems have paid dividends 20, 30 years into since they were launched. If you think about, like, I think the book The Space Economy makes an excellent example where, you don't think of Uber as a space company, but today it is. There's a part of Uber's division that focuses on making sure this GPS signal gets to the user reliably every time they need to call a ride. So it's definitely requires a lot of foresight to go into the figuring out what the total addressable market will be. Do you have any tidbits on how to think about that some more?
There's a little trick here, right? Which is to understand that you can't always look at TAM and figure out if I want to invest or not. Of course, it's a meaningful metric. But what really matters in places like the space industry, defense, and these high tech sectors is the the percentage of capturable TAM is very high if you build meaningful hardware. So even if the TAM is, say, relatively lesser than what you would expect from a venture scale, if the company has the opportunity to go and capture that small TAM, but a big chunk of that, then it's really meaningful. Right? I think that perspective a lot of people miss, and say, oh, it's not a big enough market opportunity. And I'm here thinking, well, it's not a big enough market opportunity, but there are three companies building in this space for about $3 billion or $10 billion, and therefore somebody can capture a big chunk of that, then that's very very meaningful than building for $100 billion industry, $200 billion industry, right? I think that's the lens that we choose to take at times, and we're okay with that.
So your role as an investment partner and an early stage investor in firms like Agnikul and Galaxy, Inspacity, what did the initial process of vetting the technology look like?
I think a good thing about Special is that most of us are engineers at the fund, and not really finance people, right? My background is in aerospace engineering. I've had experience working with space tech, working with payloads. They've had people who work with Toyota. We've had more space engineers in the fund itself. So I think we look at, um, from a first principle standpoint, if the technology makes sense in the long term, we look at what it would mean in terms of a positioning standpoint if it becomes what they say it would become at that time, vis-a-vis the other competing technologies that are being built. And we derive our understanding and we derive our conviction on saying, okay, this makes sense, and I see why this thesis or why this technology should necessarily be funded. And then we try and invest, right? And then of course every month we track what the company is up to, in terms of technology, in terms of team, in terms of the capital or the numbers, as is, right? So we're all through them. I mean, we're through and through working with them all along their journey of 0 to 1. So we know how this is evolving over time, and what this could become. At the time of investing, you probably don't have as much data. So you then go back to first principles and say, does this make sense or work? So there's nothing to vet in terms of technology, but there's a lot to vet in terms of people. So we do that. And because we're engineers, maybe we understand how ideas translate into the end product to some extent. And that is helping us also in terms of deriving conviction at the early stage towards saying, sure, the founder says he's able to, he wants to build this, but I can then come in and say, I can see that the founder has the ability to build it because I've done it, or I've worked in this, because then I have that filter and then perspective, right? I think that really helps us a lot.
Can I break it down with an example? Say I'm a founder and I come to you and I say, hey, Nithish, I can build a rocket engine that will take us to 1% the speed of light. I need $30 million. What would your next question be?
My next question would be to ask, why do you need $30 million, if you're not going to build the whole engine first up, right? Because then you're just setting yourself up for a very high risk. So then what we would optimize for is to figure out, okay, if your end goal is to build that whole engine and that's going to cost you $30 million, let's backtrack and see what is the smallest experimental technology that I can build with very little capital that shows that I have the proof to build, or I have the ability to build some meaningful hardware, and that is also meaningful enough for somebody else to come in and put capital, right? So I would then go back towards saying, if I can break down the rocket subsystems into the turbo machinery, to the fuel, to the propulsion systems, and the nozzles and all of that, right? I would then create a roadmap along with you, of course, towards saying you build 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we build each of those that would add up to maybe a smaller version of that engine, right? Maybe your vision of building an engine is to take people directly to space, a single stage to orbit engine, right? For that ability. But I would just say, maybe just build something very small, that just showcases that the engine can work, and then you can actually go out and build something over the next 3-4 years or so that you really wish to do. So I would just create the roadmap in such a way that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adds up to a small version of what you're trying to build. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 will add up to a medium version or interim version of what you're planning to build. And 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 is your biggest vision that can materialize in 5 years from the time that we invest in, right? And this $30 million may not necessarily come from us, but we will ensure that you are in a position that you can get those $30 million from really meaningful investors outside of the country, within the country, as such, right? But again, the challenge here is to figure out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is one thing, but also figuring out if that fifth milestone that you're getting to is meaningful for investor B to come in and put capital. If you can, of course, part of building rocket engines is also building the flight computer system, or also to build the nozzle part, right? You can choose to build the nozzle as your fifth milestone, but the nozzle may not be meaningful for the investor that's coming in, right? Or the electronics, a great electronics test may not be a meaningful milestone for the investor to come in. So maybe that milestone is that you do a small test fire of your propulsion system and showcase that, hey, something like this works, right? And that's a meaningful outcome. And these are very subjective things that because we've been in the ecosystem for long enough, we've learned over time. So we will then ask you and work with you to optimize your roadmap accordingly so that you meet these milestones. And that's how that whole journey will track. Hopefully, I'm making sense.
No,
But
totally. I think it totally makes sense. If I were to summarize in one sentence, you're looking to see if the first principles approach of whatever this person is building scales in size. If
correct.
the first principles can scale in size, then it's worthy of taking that bet and see what happens when we address the technology at a small scale.
Absolutely. And it's not just the technology, right? It's also the founder. It's also the founder, the team. Everything has to scale from a first principle standpoint. Sometimes the founders just don't have enough knowledge in them to be actually able to go out and build, right? $30 million engine that can take you directly to space. But you have the workings of getting there. So therefore you also learn the technology, but you also learn to scale along with how things progress, along with the team as well, in terms of the overall composition and a lot of other things, right?
Mhm.
And all of these have to scale simultaneously, and we would love for the founder to scale faster. But that's the trajectory that things usually take. So yeah, I think that's how we like to operate.
Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and that tees in perfectly into this next question. How is India able to build such high quality space hardware with minimal infrastructure and a research budget? Because the classic example that you always hear, right, is India's Mars mission to Mars cost $75 million, whereas the budget for the movie Gravity was $300 million, and that's the classic example of how India is able to accomplish so much in such a small budget. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a part that's always fascinated me as well. In fact, we've had a lot of investors who come from outside of the country who come and visit and look at even some of our portfolio companies and say, "Well, this is really exciting that they've managed to build so much with so little." Right? I think the reason one is again, this is only an hypothesis that I've been having for a while. Is I think the philosophy here is to be able to get early talent and train them towards building something. And therefore, that means that it comes at lesser cost than having to hire extremely experienced talent, is one part, right? For example, companies like Agnikul, I know a big chunk of the talent is coming from tier 2, tier 3 cities in India with people who've not even studied engineering, but who've really worked with hardware, worked with these polytechnic institutions, idea institutions, all of these places where people work with hardware, but they don't know space tech, right? So they then hire people like that and train them for about 6-7 years throughout their journey and make sure that they're able to develop talent for themselves and then deliver. I think the second bit is also in terms of the mindset that we have and the nature of the work that we do. We always try to figure out if something is very expensive, we try and figure out a workaround. And we try and figure out a workaround towards doing the same thing but with very little, right? I've spoken to founders who, for example, with all the space tech, right? If you're putting something in space, satellites or so, you typically do what is known as radiation hardening. You make sure that the electronics can withstand the space radiation that it experiences over 5 years in time, so that nothing gets affected. You're dealing with extremely expensive hardware, and the whole ordeal is extremely expensive because you're launching it into space and then waiting it, right? So therefore, building something without radiation hardening and still putting it to space takes a lot of courage, and you better be right. Doing something like that, right? But I've spoken and worked with founders who are actually building crazy satellite 27U 30U satellites without
Mm.
radiation hardening, but they had figured out that they don't have to essentially radiation harden for the orbit that they are in. And the other bit is also towards saying, well, even if I experience space radiation, and even if some of my transistors malfunction and flip some bit, I am able to build in enough software redundancies in place so that I can course correct. By the way, radiation hardened board can cost you up to 1 lakh, vis-a-vis a normal board would cost you 2,000, 3,000 bucks. Right? So the delta is almost 1,000x just in that. Big cost is also on the testing side of things, right? You don't necessarily have to go to labs in higher microgravity chambers to test your space tech. People are just building testing facilities on their own. For example, Angikul just put a bunch of containers together and build their own test rig, right? It's just metal containers stacked very differently and built a make do test rig that worked just fine for themselves. Vis-a-vis, if you have to go to a space lab in the US, and for you to test, just the testing cost itself would probably cover their entire funding, right? I think all these are small microcosms of what really happens in the ecosystem, and maybe that's also why we're able to do a lot more with a lot less.
Do you think that in the next decade, the investments into the Indian space economy is going to pay dividends into the global space economy? How is the Indian space economy going to impact what happens around the world?
Well, we certainly hope so. That it does, and that's been the aspiration all along as well. I think we only have about 1 or 2% of the world's space economy share, in spite of being having a lot of potential and capability. The last 6 7 years has been about just building and showcasing technology and your capability. But if you look at it, at least the front line of space tech companies in India have gotten to a stage where in the next 1 or 2 years you can expect them to commercialize something, and that's when the next wave really kicks in, right? And when you show revenue, then the amount of money that can come in after that, from a venture ecosystem standpoint and other a lot of other capital financing standpoint, is extremely exponentially different, which can then ensure that all of us can go out into the world and say, boss, we can do this at this price. Like I said, the cost to value ratio is extremely high, and we're extremely reliable. So work with us. I think that's the thesis. I think in the next 10 years we should definitely see a lot of startups really go across the world and do something meaningful for the world itself, right? So yeah.
That's a great point about the cost to value ratio. There's another thing that's going to bring in pretty high cost to value ratio, and that is Starship. So, how are Indian companies, Indian space companies, and Indian VCs thinking about the Starship economy?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I then we would I think thinking right now is to figure out and say, where else can we compete if not the cost. I think that's simply the next thought that we have to take, which is to simply say, can you compete on timing? Can you compete on how fast you can build and launch rockets or satellites, right? Starship can really offer economical launches, but again, it's going to take some time for them to put together another Starship and then again launch. And if you are able to, say, for example, if a customer comes and tells me, can you launch something in the next 2 weeks? And if you're able to do that, then you're competing with them on a different frontier. Right. So it's about finding that different frontier. And we think it's about the timing for launches. It's almost like booking an Uber to space, which is simply say, I need a ride tomorrow. Can you give me a ride? And instead of waiting, and it's also about customization. Right, we can tailor make the vehicle to match your needs instead of piggybacking on somebody else, instead of waiting for somebody else to give you the slot. Right, and all this at maybe not as economical as Starship, but at least somewhat comparable to that. Right, we're not fair off either. So it's about finding new to compete with. Yeah.
That part of it is the competition aspect of Starship to launch vehicles. I'm also curious about building for Starship. Do you think Indian companies are going to start building like mega class satellite buses without any mass constraints for flying on Starship?
I think I mean, things are already in motion. We've seen a couple of companies, for example, some of the re-entry companies that we've seen. The vehicle that they're building on would actually just go and fit inside Starship.
Wow.
And Starship can just go and launch it directly instead of just piggybacking on a couple of boosters like how the earlier space shuttles would do. This is a lot more economical in that sense, right? So, if you look at the dimensions of the vehicle and the configurations of the vehicle, in fact, the founders would come and tell you that, hey, this is best for Starship. And once that is ready, we'll just do it for that, right? So, I think that's already happening, and people are already seeing that.
So I would like to close out the podcast with one of my favorite questions that I ask almost everybody. And that question is about contrarian bets. Contrarian bet is an idea that defies conventional wisdom in the industry. So, an example is, say, SpaceX betting on making reusable rockets, but the whole industry thought that was an impossible idea. They did it anyway and they won, right? You see contrarian bets all the time as a VC. What is your contrarian bet for the space industry?
I think there's a lot of potential for Indian companies to build very meaningful in-orbit infrastructure, which is refueling systems, docking shipyards in space, where that can be used as then a platform to do deep space missions, or even manage satellites in orbit, removal of space debris, and all of that. Right. I think for all of that, there needs to be some interim player in space that acts as a hub in whatever orbit. But I think just the way things are progressing, and just in terms of, see, we have a lot of allied talent in robotics, we have a lot of allied talent in space, and we're again saying that we're competing on costs. Now we're saying that the launch vehicle market is getting very quickly crowded, and people like Starship are building very meaningful stuff that you really can't compete with them on costs. So then you look at the next frontier and see, do we have the ingredients to make sure that that frontier can succeed? And we think that frontier is in orbit infrastructure. Right. And we have the talent, we have in fact, I would say that we have probably uh, talent that's more allied to in-orbit infrastructure than even launch vehicles, right? We're very well versed with robotics, semiconductors, and we've probably worked with propulsion systems for a very long time. So it's about putting together that infrastructure in space, and I see that we have the ingredients to be able to do that. One of our portfolio companies is working on that. We know a few other companies that are also trying to build something on those lines. I think in orbit, if you're able to again provide the same cost to value ratio and do something meaningful, that could be a really big thing, right? We have companies, for example, in the West that are trying to build data centers in space, right?
Yep.
We had a chance to speak with one of those founders probably a couple of days back, or maybe just last week or so. These are extremely exciting endeavors. We have companies trying to reflect the sunlight from space to Earth and provide sunlight on demand, right? With Reflect Orbital and a few other companies on
Yeah.
those lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Lumen
think,
Orbit, Reflect
yeah,
Orbital,
yeah.
like all of these companies are Aetherflux out in San Carlos, California, like building incredibly bold bets, I should say.
And if you look at it, the common thread that goes along all of this is again servicing, maintenance, assembly of in-orbit infrastructure for all of this to materialize and come into fruition, right? And if somebody can build that, I think that's really meaningful. And I think as a country, we're really starting to look at that. The ecosystem is looking at that, and I personally believe we have the ingredients to get there. So that would be my contrarian bet or field that I would look at and say, wow, this is exciting.
Essentially, an AWS infrastructure in space.
Probably.
Uh, yeah, cool. That's a perfect note to close the podcast out on. Uh, thank you, Nithish. I'll make sure to link all your socials in the show notes. Of course, Crafting Bharat podcast that you guys should all check out. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Anurag. It's been lovely.